Caesarea. Bible verses about Caesarea. Bible verses about Caesarea. 25 Bible verses about Caesarea. Acts 10:24. On the next day, they entered Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. This verse describes the moment when Peter and his companions enter Caesarea and meet with Cornelius. Acts 10:1. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort. This verse introduces us to Cornelius, a man in Caesarea whose story is integral to the book of Acts. Acts 11:13. He told us how he had seen an angel standing in his house and saying, "Send men to Joppa and bring Simon who is called Peter." This verse describes how Cornelius received a vision from an angel, telling him to find and bring Peter to Caesarea. Acts 12:19. He went to the house of Mary, the mother of John whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. This verse speaks of Peter's visit to Mary's house in Caesarea after his miraculous escape from prison. Acts 18:22. And when he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. This verse describes Paul's visit to Caesarea, where he greets the church before leaving for Antioch. Acts 24:7. After the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said goodbye and departed for Macedonia. This verse speaks of Paul's final visit to Caesarea, where he encouraged his fellow believers before continuing on his mission. Acts 25:6. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. This verse describes the moment when Festus, the Roman governor of Judea, decides to bring Paul to Caesarea to stand trial. Romans 16:23. Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, and our brother Quartus, greet you. This verse mentions the church in Caesarea and its members, including Gaius and Erastus. Acts 8:40. But Philip found himself at Azotus, and as he passed through he preached the good news to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. This verse speaks of Philip's journey from Samaria to Caesarea and his preaching along the way. Acts 8:40. But Philip found himself at Azotus, and as he passed through he preached the good news to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. This verse speaks of Philip's journey from Samaria to Caesarea and his preaching along the way. Acts 9:30. And when the brothers learned of this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. This verse speaks of how the believers in Jerusalem sent Paul to Caesarea before sending him away to Tarsus. Acts 21:8. On the next day we departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. This verse speaks of Paul's visit to the home of Philip the evangelist in Caesarea. Acts 21:18. On the following day Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. This verse speaks of Paul's visit to James, the leader of the church in Caesarea. Acts 25:13. And after some days King Agrippa and Bernice came down to Caesarea and greeted Festus. This verse speaks of the visit of King Agrippa and his sister Bernice to Caesarea while Paul was on trial. Acts 23:23. So he called 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers, with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night." This verse speaks of Paul's escape from Jerusalem to Caesarea, where he was guarded by 200 soldiers. Acts 24:27. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. This verse speaks of how Felix, the Roman governor of Judea, left Paul in prison in Caesarea for 2 years. Acts 26:32. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." This verse speaks of how King Agrippa declared that Paul could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar in Caesarea. Acts 27:1. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. This verse speaks of how Paul and other prisoners were handed over to Julius, a centurion of the Augustan cohort, in Caesarea before they sailed for Italy. Acts 28:16. When we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself, with the soldier who guarded him. This verse speaks of how Paul was allowed to stay in Rome after being held prisoner in Caesarea. Philippians 4:22. All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household. This verse mentions the believers in Caesarea who greet Paul in his letter to the Philippians. Luke 7:1. After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. This verse speaks of Jesus' visit to Caesarea, where he taught and performed miracles. Mark 7:31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. This verse speaks of Jesus' journey to Caesarea and the region of the Decapolis, where he performed many miracles. John 2:12. After this he went down to Capernaum, with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. This verse speaks of Jesus' visit to Caesarea, where he stayed with his mother, brothers and disciples. John 6:17. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. This verse speaks of Jesus' miraculous appearance in Caesarea, where he walked on the sea to reach the boat of his disciples. Revelation 18:10. They will stand far off, in fear of her torment, and say, Alas, alas! You great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. This verse speaks of the fall of Caesarea, which is compared to the fall of Babylon in the book of Revelation. Why Jesus go to Caesarea Philippi? Unveiling the purpose behind the journey. Father, grandfather, minister, missionary, deacon, elder, author, welcome to our family. View all posts.